Over the years, there have been efforts to curtail gun violence in the U.S., but in the wake of last weekend's mass shootings, lawmakers are facing renewed calls to enact gun legislation. And earlier this year, the Department of Justice banned bump stocks in the U.S., and stricter background checks were put into law in 2008 to screen people who were legally declared mentally ill. Additionally, the Brady Act in 1994 also required background checks for handguns. That same year, assault weapons were banned, but this legislation expired 10 years later. A study from 2016 looked at the effectiveness of gun legislation at the state level. It lays out just 3 laws that would significantly decrease firearm deaths if implemented nationwide. Well, the report was published in the British medical journal, The Lancet. Dr. Bindu Kalesan is a co-author of that report. She's also an assistant professor at Boston University's School of Medicine. So, Dr. Kalesan, what are the 3 laws that you propose?
Well, our study found that having background checks for firearms right before buying firearms, for ammunition as well, and also some kind of an identification requirement for firearms will be very effective, or will help in reducing firearm deaths. But I have to say, because we have our data is not complete in the sense that we're looking at just firearm deaths alone, but there are more firearm injuries, the non-fatal injuries, which will later result in a lot more morbidity. And we don't include that in our analysis because we have very poor data available. So these 3 laws can help definitely reduce the gun deaths, but that was using data in 2009.
So I want to ask you, the third thing you mentioned here, firearm identification. Can you sort of explain what firearm identification proposal you have and what that would mean?
So instead of a proposal, we looked at microstamping, some kind of a firearm identification, which will help in sort of crime control. So currently what they do is we don't have a national registry for firearm owners. So we don't know who owns what weapons. So when a shooting happens and if they are able to get the crime weapon, they have to do old school type of picking up the phone and figuring out where the shooter got the gun from, and basically find a trace. So because we don't have these in place, these surveillance information in place, it's very difficult for ATF to do that. So having that microstamping process will help that.
So, If you look at the recent mass shootings, Dayton, El Paso, Gilroy, all of the suspected shooters bought their weapons illegally. There's no indication that anything in their record would have been flagged in a background check. Do you think that these 3 proposals in your report could have made a difference in these particular cases?
Well, I have to say, the problem is that it's like the tip of the iceberg. So when what you see as mass shooting and school shootings is just 2% of the problem. So you're trying to say, okay, let's fix this, do a Band-Aid fix right now. There is a lot more gun violence, which is pervasive in the society. It happens every day. The daily toll is huge. But of course, when you look at mass shootings, it's horrific. So therefore, we tend to respond overtly for mass shootings as opposed to the daily toll of gun violence. So I understand why we want to fix it by these three laws, but remember, it's like, you want to really get to the root of the problem rather than just trying to take out mass shooting. It's like having an advanced stage of disease and trying to cover up symptoms.
Your report also looked at 25 state gun laws. 9 of them were associated with higher rates of gun deaths. What were those laws?
Well, we studied several of these laws, but at the same time, I think I have to make this clear. What we did is kind of a simulation sort of study where if we can have a federal level law, not just a state level law. And the reason is this: the state borders are very porous, and we have reciprocity between several states, which means that the guns brought from one state can travel to another state. And it's very easy. So, for example, in Massachusetts, there are guns from Maine coming down. And you can look at Massachusetts as a state and look at the firearm laws. Oh, we've got really great, strict firearm laws. But then you look at Boston alone, there are about between 150 to 300 shooting incidents per month. So if you look at least one shooting incident per day is happening in Boston alone, which means that we are getting really good at saving people, and people are not dying because of guns, but we are surviving people. It doesn't mean that they're criminals or heroes. It's just that they will have a long-term disability. So I'd like to really emphasize on gun violence as a systemic problem, and it's an ongoing problem rather than trying to find these short fixes with mass shootings and school shootings. We have to really get to the root of the problem and really tackle what is going on in the society.
You mentioned in addition to mass shootings, there were 7 people who were killed, dozens more injured in shootings in Chicago over the weekend. The city has a history of gun violence. Illinois actually has some of the strictest gun laws in the nation. So how could your proposal curb gun violence in a place like Chicago?
So that's going to be very difficult, because what we did was look at everything on a state level, right? So the local level situations vary, which means the built environment, the social determinants of health. So there are pockets of places which have high violence, and they tend to be poorest communities. And poorer communities don't have enough social capital, and that means given the poverty, crimes are high, and we don't really invest a lot in our poor communities. So it's very easy to criminalize everybody in a poor community, kind of moving the perpetrator's intent to the person who's victimized, and say, oh, okay, that person is from Chicago, where there is a lot of violence, so let's just call them also criminals. Whereas you have a white person from a white neighborhood who's shot and who survived, they're heroes for surviving such things. So we have to be very careful not to criminalize people who live in poor communities.
So much to think about, and we're just fascinated by the study and also the fact that there's so much work to be done. Dr. Bindu Kalesan, thank you very much for sharing your report.
Thank you.